my main job now is training on safeguarding, but this issue comes up every single time as the issue that worries people. It's very, very difficult to deal with, and I may not tell you anything you don't know or give you answers. People often want answers, and there often aren't answers. So we're going to try and cover in about 10 or 15 minutes the challenges that people face in practice on safeguard. That's my routine, isn't it? On self-neglect. We'll touch very briefly on the duty of care and some issues around the Mental Capacity Act. And then really what I was asked to look at was what works. So what can we do that actually, or what levers, what tools have we got that we can look to help us to deal with people who self-neglect. I was saying this morning when I first got here that self-neglect is not just one type of person or one type of behaviour. It ranges from people who we see a lot on TV now about people hoarding and neglecting themselves and living in really insanitary conditions, but we also have a whole range of people, as we've heard from our presenters earlier, well at least in the session here, that neglect themselves through drug and alcohol abuse. So, and the issues for them are very different to the ones who hoard. So we need to bear in mind, as with everything in social care, that everybody's different and the different responses are required. So what are the issues? So we've got, it's often features in a serious case review, so people actually die. They neglect themselves to the point that they die, or their circumstances lead to things like house fires and stuff like that, so they end up dead, and then we end up having to do something about we have to look at why that happened. And I think that's one of the reasons that we now have it in a kind of safeguarding area, is because previously people would go out, councils would go out to people who self-neglect and say, hello, how can we help you? And they would say, on your bike, go away, leave me alone. And they would say they're choosing to live like that. We've heard that, haven't we, before, that kind of they choose to live like that. And choice is a very strange word to apply to people living in such what others would see as difficult and awful circumstances. So, but that's why now it's coming into safeguarding agenda, is we can't just leave people if they choose to live like that. We have to keep revisiting it and trying to make people as safe as possible and reduce the risk as much as possible. As I've just said, that it's been categorised in the statutory guidance, and I was just saying to the lady who's going to speak next, Michelle, that actually it doesn't mean that everybody who self-neglects needs to be safeguarded. It means that we can put it in that arena and try and work with the same kind of ideas around that. It doesn't mean that everybody who self-neglects needs a safeguarding response. Often that wouldn't be the appropriate response. It's very alarming sometimes for staff to deal with, so we have issues around staff support, staff needing help and guidance to deal with these kind of situations. We're expected to do something. We see things in the local newspaper or on the media, and they've left them, they haven't helped them, when actually the person wouldn't accept help, and there's nothing we could do about it. So we need to be very clear about when we can intervene and when we can't, and we need to be really careful that we record everything we have done and everything we've considered and tried, so that if something terrible does happen, we've done everything that we could have done. And the last one is pretty obvious. There's loads of barriers in our way, usually procedural ones. There has been historically a lack of clarity about who's responsible, specifically if the person doesn't have clear care and support needs, they don't fit into the mental health team, they don't fit into any other kind of team. So then we have the usual argy-bargy about who's going to deal with this person. So there's often an argument about who might respond. I've already said, if they don't have care and support needs, safeguarding might not be the best option. I've just, sorry, I've forgotten your name. Elaine has just told me that you do have self-neglect within your safeguarding forums. So the board deals with it, you have a safeguarding protocol, and you have the hoarding board, is what you were saying, yeah, as well. So at least in Bromley, you have actually addressed that within your safeguarding arena. We have work patterns that don't support long-term. We all know that. That's down to resources, that we don't support people to work in the long term with people very well. I don't know if you do here, but across the country it's a difficult area because we don't have the resource to put in. There are lots of issues around information sharing which often come up in serious case reviews as well. We always see that in serious case reviews that people didn't work well together, and we've heard from the floor that it doesn't, even though we keep saying things, it doesn't always work well in practice. Limited understanding of what legal options we do have, should we need to resort to those in self-neglect cases. Difficulty implementing the MCA in self-neglect. I think people would say that it is often a very difficult assessment of someone who self-neglects, whether or not they have capacity to make their own decisions around that. And the usual lack of resources. So lots of things that actually prevent us from being able to respond well to people who are self-neglecting. And then there's that tricky balance that we see in the legislation around person-centred working. If the person is the best judge of their own well-being and they want to live like that, then we're back with that argument about choice, aren't we? So we have to make sure that we try and get the balance of listening to people, hearing what their life is like, getting to know them, understanding why they are living the way they are, and then trying to work with that so that we keep them safe and reduce the risk as much as possible. I don't have time to tell you why there's a snail at the bottom there on the duty of care, but some of you will know that the duty of care stems from a case called the Paisley snail. And if you Google it, there's a nice little video that explains that. But basically, we often hear the duty of care kind of quoted and slightly misused in the sense that people say, well, I've got to interfere, it's my duty of care. We don't have the right to intervene with people's lives based on our duty of care. What we do have is a responsibility not to do something or not do something, fail to do something that would then cause harm to others. So we must be careful not to overuse that kind of, oh, well, it's my duty of care type of approach. On the Mental Capacity Act, there are two things I wanted to talk about. One is fluctuating capacity, which is often a case for people with drug and alcohol abuse issues. Really, I think it's very difficult for us to use the Mental Capacity Act to deal with people with self-neglect issues, partly because it is fluctuating and partly because their decision is not an immediate one. It's a long-term living circumstances, life choices issue. So if we look at the MCA and it says we've got to wait for make decisions, we've got to try several times, can we break down the decision, don't rush people, these kind of things. And if we do that with people who are self-neglecting, we will find that most of them actually have capacity to make a decision about how they're living, and so that we cannot then make decisions on their behalf. And in case law, even where someone lacks capacity, I think I don't know the name of the judge, but there was a case where he said that there's no cliff edge. So even if someone lacks capacity, we've still got to work alongside them, hear what they're saying, hear what they want. So that it doesn't just mean that someone lacks capacity, okay, we can do what we want with them. We can't. We've still got to work along that way. So it makes actually using mental capacity in self-neglect cases actually quite difficult. And I've heard this research from America, NAIC, this idea of... have you heard of executive capacity? It's the idea of being able to execute your decision. So, someone says, I'm going to definitely change my ways and decide to live in a different way or whatever. And I've actually heard of people, and I've read it in somebody's policy, a safeguarding or a self-neglect policy, I can't remember which, saying that if someone doesn't follow up on what they've said they're going to do, i.e. tidy up their house and have a bath every week or something like that, then they lack capacity. It just doesn't make any sense. We all do it, don't we? We all say, I'm going to stop eating cake, or I'm going to stop smoking, or I'm going to drink less, and then we don't do it. It doesn't mean we lack capacity. It's nonsense. So I would argue, and so would my esteemed colleague Rachel Griffiths, who was the CQC's expert on MCA until recently, that we cannot say people lack capacity because they don't follow up on what they've said they will do. So don't make that mistake either. I'm not going to read through this whole list because it's pretty obvious that we need effective interagency working, but I'm leaving you with this as a checklist, and I think some of these you've already said you've got in place in Bromley anyway, so that you can have, or look to having best practice in self-neglect. I gave you this, and because as I said, I've got limited time, but this one and the next one. So this is around the kind of strategic setup that you have, so that you've got the ability to work well with people who self-neglect. And then this checklist, which is kind of I will go through this one. So we've got you've got a policy, which you've said you have. There's a multi-agency approach, and that's overseen by your safeguarding board here, as it is in most areas. We need to make sure the Mental Capacity Act is well understood, that people can use it and utilise it in self-neglect cases, so that we've got some kind of guidance and help for people how to get through that. Persevering with people who self-neglect is really important. So if they say go away, which they often do, we go back. But we don't go back to talk about whether they've got a house full of rubbish. We go back to have a conversation with them about how they are. How they're, you know, what are they thinking? What do they want you? Any conversation. Michael Preston Shute, who some of you will have heard of, is an eminent writer in social care, said you should go around with a pasty. And I thought that was quite a strange thing to say, but then he said, no, you could go and you've got a pasty. Knock on the door, would you like a pasty? And then have a chat about something. So not, oh, can I come into your house and clear up all this mess and get it out? No, that's not what they want you to do. They want you to get to know them and trust them, hear them. So the perseverance is a really big issue when it comes to working with people who self-neglect. We've got to gain trust. Where am I up to? Sorry. I've already said that, making sure you record everything really well so that you are okay if things do go wrong. And yes, supporting your staff to get through these issues. And the pressure from other agencies, that would be largely from individuals or other organisations who are saying, why aren't you doing anything? And then just finally, when I do the training on self-neglect, I do an exercise where I ask people to ask these 3 questions. But obviously we're not going to do that today. But in your pack you've got this, which is kind of a list of, we'll call them levers. So the things you can think about utilising in terms of responding and trying to get to the bottom of helping people. And I think that's the end of my bit, and I'll hand over to Michelle. Is that it? What am I pointing at? Why isn't it oh, that's it. That's my contact details. If you do have any questions, I'm quite happy to answer by email. Oh, and I should just say that before I go, that the self-neglect stuff on our website is all carried out by Michael Preston Shute and Susie Bray, who are the main researchers who've looked into this in the UK. They have got large academic documents on the website which are quite hard to get through, but I do intend shortly to do some sort of more accessible materials on self-neglect. But do have a look at what's on the website. And just as I mentioned to Michelle a minute ago, there's also something coming up which is also helpful, the interface between mental health and mental capacity legislation. There's some e-learning stuff that's coming up next month, which might help with these kind of issues. So on to Michelle.
Thank you for that. And there's the clicker. Oh, lovely, a clicker. My name is Michelle Murray, and I just want to make one correction on your packs. It says I'm a barrister. I'm a barrister at law. My day job is as an inspector, so I'm not working as a barrister. I'm working as an inspector with the CQC in mental health. But I'm here today to talk about hoarding from an advocate's point of view. And I'm going to go through some of the frameworks in law and also to talk about how important it is to have a person-centered approach. In Bromley, there is a hoarding panel, and they took 23 referrals in the last 6 months. And I asked if any of them had come from hoarders themselves. I don't have the number that did, but I would be surprised if many hoarders came forward and said, I have a problem. When hoarders come forward and say, I have a problem, usually what they refer to is, I have a problem because I've got the fire brigade at my door, I've got the police at my door, I have the Mental Health Act assessment team at my door, and they want in, can you help? That's the problem they have. They don't see, many of the people I've worked with didn't see hoarding itself as the problem. Yes, so it's on a spectrum like much of life. You can start as a hoarder, or you can start as a collector. Recently, they've added hoarding into the DSM, and what's good about this is that one of the levers, one of the support systems out there for people who hoard is the NHS. There's a number of things that can help hoarders, such as counseling, CBT, and mindfulness, to understand and support and alleviate the suffering that's behind the hoarding. Often, as an IMHA and an IMCA, where I met hoarders was on the Mental Health Act, on the mental health wards. They were detained under a Section 2 or a Section 3 under the Mental Health Act, and they were brought in often on a Section 135, which means that the AMPS and the Section 12 doctors, they're called, and the police went to the person's home and gained entry and said to the person, well, you lack, actually it doesn't matter whether they lack capacity or not under the Mental Health Act, but they would say you're a danger to yourself, you're at risk of severe self-neglect, you're coming to the hospital. And then advocates would meet with these people on the wards and they would say, help me, what can I do? The doctor has said that he's agreed that a deep clean while I'm detained on the ward is in my best interest. Now, on the face of it, a deep clean seems to alleviate the problem. It can alleviate the problem of risk of fire, vermin, and just general, if there's any impact on the neighbors. So it would solve a number of problems from an objective point of view. But from a subjective point of view, to do a deep clean against that person's wishes is a violation. It's part of who they are and part of their suffering. And if they, in a sense, go home and find that all of that is taken away, it can be incredibly distressing and could trigger other crises, a mental health crisis, which isn't good for anybody, especially not the person involved. I don't know if you can see this properly, this slide, but it's the clutter index rating from not too bad to you can't use the room at number 9, and the fire brigade often will choose number 5 to decide to intervene and say this is a fire risk and to take legal measures to get the person to sort it out themselves, and if not, they will do it. So as much as Hoarding UK advocates for engaged practices that allows time and encourages real change, often this isn't possible. And the reason is, at Hoarding UK, often we will get a referral at that last moment, when there's no time left, when there's either an eviction order or there's people at the door who are going to force entry. They've got a warrant from the magistrates. And as I said at the beginning, that is the person's problem, not the hoarding. So sometimes time is not on your side. The CARE Act, moving over to social services, the CARE Act has broadened its scope so that's easier to identify people who have hoarding within the CARE Act legislation. So these are the care and support needs that that person may have. So the outcomes within the CARE Act for adults with care and support needs, you'd be looking at the ones in red, being able to make use of the adult's home safely and maintaining a habitable home environment. And then we have safeguarding. And as you were saying, it's if the person's making a capacious decision to hoard, as in they understand all the options that are available, they understand the consequences of continuing to hoard, and those consequences including being evicted, having the fire brigade come in and close the property down. If they understand those options and they choose to keep hoarding, they choose to live like that, it's difficult for safeguarding to gain much traction. Advocacy and Hoarding UK, it's it's one of the great levers. And it's difficult because sometimes as advocates, we will think, well, yes, the fire brigade are at your door. Yes, you've got, you're at risk of losing your tenancy because you've breached the conditions. But sometimes that's a trigger that's needed to get that person to step back and think, actually, I do need help and support. Can you please help me so I don't get evicted? Can you please help me so that I can continue living in my own home? And sometimes that reality is so well at the door that they will accept help. And often advocacy can be, a referral to advocacy can be really helpful because sometimes, because you don't have, as practitioners, the time it takes to reach out, to understand that person and to understand what they can, will and will not accept. Sometimes an advocacy referral or a Hoarding UK referral could be very valuable. Now, the difficult thing from a professional point of view is if you're at that point in time when you've got someone at the door with a warrant, sometimes it's difficult to stop that process. But there are things that you can check for, such as, has a safeguarding referral been made? Has every attempt been made to try and reach that person? Have they had a needs assessment? Have you looked at their mental health under the Mental Health Act? There are things that can delay that process and show that from the social services or from the Mental Health Act point of view, you have tried everything you can to reach a person-centered solution to the problem. So this is under the Mental Capacity Act, and sometimes it can be very straightforward, assessing whether the person has capacity or lacks capacity, and sometimes it cannot be very straightforward because they're within the Mental Capacity Act, where we find the hiccup when people have hoarding issues. It's, are you assured that that person is weighing the consequences and making a decision? Or when they're weighing that decision, is the prevalence of their mental health problem making it that there are no other options except to keep hoarding? And that is a very difficult balance to make, and you have to document everything down very, very carefully when you're making that Mental Capacity Act assessment, because it is very, very difficult to come to a decision that that person actually lacks the capacity around the decision to accept support from social services or from the mental health service. And it is difficult because on the other side, powers that, say, public health have, that the police have, that the fire brigade has, that the local authority has if they are the ones who hold the lease. Their powers are very strong. They're set in legislation, and they know where they are with their rights. But for someone who is trying to reach out to that person and trying either to make a best interest decision or to get them to accept support, it's on the other hand very soft. But what they do have is the Human Rights Act, which says that everyone has a right to a private life and to enjoyment of their private possessions.